Welcome to the deep dive. You know, we've been getting some really interesting material shared with us lately. Stuff that makes you pause and think, why, after all this time focusing on making work better, do we still seem to hit the same old walls?
Exactly. And you flagged this really insightful piece, CAVERNA by Marynês Pereira. She kicks it off with this killer question. Have we gone back to the corporate cave, or did we never actually leave?
Right. That's really what we want to dig into today. Why do some of these workplace dynamics feel so, well, so stuck, like a recurring theme?
Yeah, like we're dealing with the same stuff over and over, difficult bosses, teams not quite gelling, communication breakdowns.
Precisely. So our mission today is to unpack that. We'll look at how management ideas have changed or maybe haven't changed enough, and also bring in some really fascinating insights from neuroscience.
Hopefully giving everyone a clearer picture of what's actually going on under the surface. Yeah, and maybe, just maybe, point towards some ways out of this loop.
And before we jump in, it's worth mentioning Marynês Pereira's background, right? She's got serious credentials.
Oh, absolutely. Over 4 decades in the corporate world. She's a specialist in neurobusiness, neurocoaching, positive psychology, plus all sorts of behavioral analysis and emotional intelligence tools.
So she's seen things firsthand. She's not just an academic looking from the outside.
Definitely not. And she makes it clear she's not trying to give us the single answer. It's more about connecting the dots, linking historical management thinking with what we now know about the brain.
Okay, so let's start with that historical perspective. She takes us back a bit, doesn't she, to a more optimistic time.
Yeah, back to the early days of the excellent place to work idea. She mentions Robert Levering's book, A Great Place to Work. The original was 91, Brazilian edition 97.
Ah, yes, I remember that push. It was all about trust, pride, camaraderie, the good stuff.
Exactly. Asking that fundamental question. What actually makes a place good to work at? What are those core human things?
It feels like a really positive starting point. But things changed, didn't they? The conversation shifted.
We sure did. Fast forward about a decade to 2007. Robert Sutton comes out with the no asshole rule, or chega de babaquiche, as the Portuguese title puts it.
Yeah, the title says it all. Suddenly, the focus wasn't just building the good, but actively getting rid of the bad, the toxic stuff.
Sutton really hammered home how damaging those toxic behaviors are. So the question became less about what makes it good and more how do we eliminate what makes it so bad.
And Marynês adds a really interesting observation from that time, right? About leadership.
Yeah, she recalls how many leaders were kind of denial, defensive. They couldn't or wouldn't see how their own behavior might be part of the problem. That lack of self-awareness was a huge barrier.
Still is, probably, in many places. It highlights that difference between knowing a problem exists and recognizing your role in it.
Absolutely. So Levering was about fostering the positive, Sutton about tackling the negative. Two sides of the same coin, really.
And even then, fast forward another decade to around 2017, you'd expect things to be, well, further along.
You would, wouldn't you? But Marynês points out that major books then were still dealing with the basics. Culture, communication, leadership issues. It suggests those earlier solutions hadn't really stuck.
Or weren't fully implemented, maybe? Like, we knew what to do, but didn't consistently do it.
Seems like it. It makes you wonder about the depth of change. She uses Ray Dalio's principles, Life and Work, from 2017 as an example.
Ah, the radical truth and radical transparency guy.
Exactly. The fact that he felt the need to lay out principles around being truthful and transparent suggests those things were still, pretty big hurdles in organizations. Difficulty admitting mistakes, lack of openness.
Yeah, it echoes those earlier themes. Trust, avoiding toxicity. Still critical, still maybe missing, even in 2017.
And this is where Marynês brings in the neuroscience perspective. It offers a deeper layer, a more fundamental reason why these problems are so persistent.
Okay, let's get into that. It's not just bad management techniques, it's biology.
In a way, yes. It connects deeply to how our brains are wired. She talks about the social brain and our threat response.
Right, the idea that we're wired for connection, for safety within a group.
Precisely. Think evolutionarily. Belonging was survival. So when a workplace feels unsafe because of toxic behavior, lack of trust, constant criticism, whatever, it triggers our brain's alarm system.
The amygdala.
The amygdala.
Yeah.
That's the fight or flight center.
Basically, yeah. It's the brain's threat detector. And when it's constantly firing because of workplace stress, it hijacks resources.
Hijacks them from where?
From the prefrontal cortex. That's the part responsible for higher thinking planning, problem solving, creativity, collaboration, all the stuff you actually need to do good work.
So if your brain's constantly in alarm mode, you literally can't think straight or be innovative.
Exactly. It explains, as Marynês notes, why remote work can feel like such a relief for some people. It's an escape from that constant low-level threat state. Makes total sense. You can't focus if you feel like you're walking on eggshells. What about the status quo bias she mentions? How does that fit in?
Well, our brains are kind of wired to prefer things staying the same. Change takes energy, effort. It feels uncertain, maybe even risky.
Even if the current situation isn't great?
Even then, there's a cognitive and emotional cost to change. So transforming a whole organizational culture that runs up against this natural neurological resistance, especially if the people in charge are kind of comfortable with how things are.
It's like inertia, but in our brains. Hard to shift course.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And then you layer on the issue of emotional intelligence, or a lack of it, in leadership.
Ah, yeah. This feels critical.
It really is.
Yeah.
Marynês makes the point that leaders often get promoted for technical skill, not necessarily people skills. Some companies might even, maybe unintentionally, promote people who fit that toxic asshole mold Sutton described, if they get short-term results.
Right. So what happens neurologically when leaders lack empathy or self-awareness?
Well, without empathy, that ability to understand and genuinely connect with others' feelings, and without good self-regulation, it's almost impossible to create psychological safety.
Even with good intentions.
Even then, actions can be easily misinterpreted. Feedback can feel like an attack. You need those skills: active listening, reading the room, managing your own reactions to build trust. Otherwise, you just keep triggering that threat response in people.
So a lack of emotional intelligence basically keeps the alarm bells ringing for the team.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then she talks about culture itself as a collective habit. I
Right.
found that really insightful.
Culture as a habit. Explain that.
Think about personal habits. Brushing your teeth, checking your phone. They're automatic patterns run by a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. It's our autopilot.
Okay.
Well, organizational culture is kind of like the sun of all those collective ingrained behaviors. The way things are done around here. It becomes automatic, habitual for the group.
So changing the culture is like trying to break a deeply ingrained habit for the entire organization.
Exactly. It takes conscious effort, repetition of new behaviors, consistent reinforcement to rewire those pathways. And that takes time and focus, which is hard to maintain with day-to-day pressures.
That really explains why just announcing a culture change doesn't work. You have to actively build new habits.
Precisely. And on top of all this, you have the modern issue of cognitive overload and burnout.
Which a toxic environment makes worse, I imagine.
Absolutely. The sheer volume and pace of work are already pushing our limits. At a stressful, unsupportive environment, it just throws fuel on the fire.
How does that impact us neurologically?
Chronic stress messes with memory, attention, emotional regulation. When people are burned out, they just don't have the capacity, mentally or emotionally, to drive positive change or even do their best work.
It sounds like a vicious cycle. Bad environment causes burnout. Burnout makes it harder to fix the environment.
That's exactly the trap. And this leads Marynês to a pretty stark conclusion about why things often don't change. She suggests that often there's just a fundamental lack of real will to change among those with power. That old command and control mindset is just incredibly sticky.
So if the desire isn't truly there at the top, nothing much will happen.
That seems to be her assessment.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough pill to swallow, but maybe realistic in some cases.
Okay, wow. That's a lot on the problem side. But she does offer some hope, right? Some ways forward.
Thankfully, yes.
Yeah.
She pivots to focus on conscious action, things we can do.
What's top of this?
Cultivating psychological safety. Actively, intentionally creating spaces where people feel safe to speak up, make mistakes, give feedback, be vulnerable without fear.
That sounds like the absolute foundation, if you don't have that.
Exactly. Nothing else works.
Yeah.
This directly calms that amygdala response we talked about, frees up brain power.
Makes sense. What else?
Developing emotional intelligence in leadership. Real training, real development focused on empathy, active listening, self-awareness, self-regulation. Not just talking about it, but building the skills.
So leaders need to model it, live it.
Absolutely. And third, communicating the why. Why are we changing? Connecting it to a larger purpose that taps into the brain's reward system, builds motivation.
People need to know why it matters, not just what to do.
Right. And then fourth, deliberately installing new habits. Using rituals, clear processes, positive reinforcement to make the desired behaviors the new normal. Actually rewiring the culture.
Building those new collective habits we talked about.
Precisely. And finally, promoting well-being and recovery. recognizing we're human, encouraging breaks, real disconnections, stress management, preventing that burnout cycle.
So it's a whole system approach, psychological, behavioral, practical.
Exactly. It addresses the brain and the workplace structures.
Now, Marynês also touches on that bigger question, are we regressing as a society or as workplaces?
Yeah, but she doesn't think it's about losing capability. Her take is more that we're failing to apply what we already know from psychology, management, neuroscience.
So why the failure to apply?
She points to things like archaic power structures, intense short-term pressure, and just the sheer difficulty of changing those deeply embedded habits, both individual and collective. Like, we have the knowledge, but something keeps getting in the way of using it effectively.
It's like knowing the healthier way to live, but still reaching for the junk food because it's easier or feels better in the moment.
That's a good analogy.
Hmm?
And she adds an interesting thought about Gen Z.
Oh, what's her view there?
She speculates that maybe their higher expectations around well-being and purpose, perhaps linked to brain development, might make them less willing to put up with these old, unhealthy models. Their inadaptation, she calls it, might actually be a healthy rejection of dysfunctional systems.
That's provocative. Their resistance could be a catalyst for change.
Could be. And then, to show these ideas are still very current, she brings in Adam Grant's recent book, Hidden Potential.
Right, for 2023. How does that connect?
Well, Grant's focus is on how environments shape our ability to develop potential. He argues character skills aren't fixed, they're grown. And workplaces are crucial environments for that growth or lack of it.
So a bad workplace doesn't just make you unhappy, it actively stops you from reaching your potential.
Exactly. And Marynês connects Grant's ideas back to Levering, Sutton, and Dalio beautifully.
How so?
Levering's a great place to work. Well, Grant would say, if it doesn't nurture potential, it's not truly great. Sutton's no asshole rule. Grant shows how toxic environments actively destroy potential. Dalio's principles for transparency and learning from mistakes. Grant highlights how environments without those things block potential by denying opportunity and safety.
Wow, it really ties it all together. Different voices, different eras, same core message about the environment's impact.
It really does. And Marynês grounds it again in the brain neuroplasticity, the role of dopamine in motivated learning, the need for safety to keep cortisol low. She calls toxic environments anti-neurobiological.
Anti-neurobiological, that's powerful. It really emphasizes that this isn't just about feelings, it's about how our brains are designed to function or malfunction in these settings.
Right. And her final message is one of agency. We know enough now about how our brains react. We can redesign organizations intentionally. We don't have to be stuck in the cave.
So if we boil it all down, what's the big takeaway from Marynês Pereira's analysis for everyone listening?
I think it's that these persistent workplace problems aren't just random bad luck or isolated bad managers. They're systemic, rooted in our psychology, and made worse because we consistently fail to apply the knowledge we actually have.
And her call to action, what should we be doing?
It's a call for conscious effort from everyone. Actively build psychological safety. Practice empathy, especially in leadership. Communicate the why. Intentionally build better habits. Prioritize well-being. It's work, but it's necessary work.
And she leaves us with that very direct question at the end, doesn't she?
She does. The time for change is now. Shall we go together?
Ahora la mudanza es agora. Vamos juntos. It's a challenge, an invitation to own our part in creating something better.
It definitely makes you think. So for everyone listening, take a moment. Which of these ideas really hits home for you? Psychological safety, emotional intelligence, purpose, habits, well-being. Which one feels most relevant to your own work life? And maybe think about one small thing, just one step you could take in your own context to nudge things in a more positive direction. That's definitely something to chew on after we wrap up.